It was at Brussels on the eve of this departure from that city that the first consul received Monsieur Lombard, privy councillor to the King of Prussia, who brought him a letter from his sovereign. The purport of this letter was to compliment the head of the consular government on the occasion of his arrival in Brussels, and to express the wish that steps might be taken to relieve the townships in Lower Saxony of the charges caused by the presence of the French troops there. Nor was Monsieur Lombard's mission confined to furthering Prussian interest alone. He was to endeavor to find out what were Napoleon's intentions as to the limits which he proposed to give to his occupation of Hanover and some of the other portions of the German states. These matters had been suggested to the Prussian government by Russia. Napoleon, who had at that time only one interest, namely an alliance with Prussia, received Monsieur Lombard in the friendliest fashion, conversed with him at great length, and showed him real confidence. He spoke of the value which he attached to the friendship of the King of Prussia. He expressed his desire to ally himself closely with this monarch and to advance the interests of Prussia, and with this in view to do whatever might please the king. His interest, equally with that of the powers of the North, was to put an end to the maritime tyranny of England, and the only means of accomplishing this object was to close all ports of Germany against her. He asked that Prussia should definitely agree with France so that their mutual alliance might be genuine and effective. These explanations, made with that winning charm which was so irresistible in Napoleon, produced a great impression on the mind of the Prussian envoy. His report of their conversation delighted the King of Prussia, but with his usual want of decision and yielding disposition, the king feared to engage himself too far with France. He replied by making insufficient offers and proposals of neutrality, and in the end declined the alliance, whilst proposing to postpone its completion. Monsieur Lombard was a French refugee of the French colony in Berlin, a distinguished litterateur and statesman. He had been brought up in the doctrine of neutrality. Faithful to this doctrine, he made use of the credit in which he stood with his sovereign to preach neutrality in the king's council, his political sentiments, and his inclination for France, from which he had sprung, have very unjustly caused him to be accused of having sold himself to the French government. His retirement in 1806, on the eve of Prussia's call to arms, was a disaster for his country. Whenever the first consul wrote to the king, he used to say to me, laughing, "We must be careful about the style of our letters. The King of Prussia has men in his cabinet who know how to speak and to write French very well." He referred to Monsieur Lombard. Colonel Capera, legate a laetare from the papal see, accompanied the first consul on this journey. The presence of this prelate, distinguished as he was for his piety, his spirit of toleration, and his lofty character, had been deemed necessary in a country troubled with religious quarrels, while his conciliatory spirit was eminently qualified to appease. At Namur, the cardinal should have been lodged at the house of the bishop of the diocese, and, as a matter of fact, the episcopal palace had been got ready for his reception. But from reports received on the irregular life led by the bishop and on his gallant adventures, it was feared lest the legate should find himself in such an abode in strange company. This occurrence brought forth a number of satirical verses and allusions which, till then, had only been whispered in Namur. In consequence of the discredit which was thus thrown on the bishop, he was asked to resign his see. This he did, but only after expressly stipulating that his episcopal revenues should be paid to him during his lifetime. On his return from this journey, Napoleon spent the months of September and October at Saint-Cloud, occupying himself with his accustomed ardor on the details of the Bologna expedition, on internal affairs, and on the solution of the various negotiations which had been commenced with the different European ministries in consequence of the renewal of hostilities with England. In the first days of the month of November of the same year, 1803, the first consul made a second journey, which lasted a fortnight, to Bologna. The object of this journey was to visit the ports of Bologna and of Memoirs, and to inspect the works which he had ordered to facilitate the assembling of the various divisions of the flotilla. He spent a day and a night in the roads on board a gunboat and was present always on the front line at an engagement between the frigates of the English cruisers under the command of Admiral Keith and a division of the French flotilla. The fire from our sloops and that of the mortars on our coast batteries forced the enemy to retire. 6 weeks later, Napoleon left Paris suddenly to undertake a new journey along the French coast, which lasted 10 days. Only 2 hours' notice was given to this journey, the horses being ordered in the name of General Bessières. The preceding journey had been as secretly prepared, that time under the name of General Duroc. These precautions were taken in consequence of a suspected plot to kidnap the person of Napoleon. Whilst Napoleon was occupied with these preparations, whilst all the efforts of France were employed on the naval war, and her frontiers on the Adige and the Rhine were defenseless, Austria was marching her troops under false pretenses towards Bavaria, Swabia, and Switzerland, reinforcing her army in Italy at the same time. The Russians on their side were assembling armies in Podolia, behind the Vistula, and in Lithuania. Camps were being formed in Livonia, ready to descend on Pomerania, to act in concert with the Swedes and the English. 4 men out of every 500 in Russia were called to arms. And finally, in England, bodies of troops were being formed on the Downs to be shipped to the Cuxhaven to join the Russian and Swedish troops. The court of Naples was also preparing to assemble its army. Napoleon had his eye on all these movements. He took his precautions for the defense of Italy and spared no pains to enlighten Austria on the pacific nature of his intentions towards her and point out to where her real interests lay. Marshal Mortier, having assured the submission of Hanover, returned to Paris, where he was appointed one of the 4 generals of the guards. He was replaced in the command of the army in Hanover by General Bernadotte. During the first consul's absence, his sister Pauline, widow of General Leclerc, who had died at San Domingo in 1802, married Prince Camille Borghese, a member of one of the most illustrious and richest families in Rome. This prince, who at a very early age had embraced the principles of the French Revolution, had served in the ranks of our army in Italy during the memorable campaigns of General Bonaparte. He had attached himself to the commander-in-chief, who in his turn had taken him into his affections. The union of his sister with Prince Borghese was accordingly entirely to Napoleon's taste. He received the overtures made to him on this subject with the greatest satisfaction. The marriage was celebrated at Mortefontaine at the house of Joseph Bonaparte. Pauline followed her new husband to Rome, where a few months later she lost her son Dermida, who was General Bonaparte's godson. On Napoleon's accession to the empire, a senatus consultum conferred on Prince Borghese the rights of a French citizen and prince. On the same day on which the first consul returned from his 10 days' journey to Bologna, the legislative body was convoked. The session had been opened according to the usual custom by the Minister of the Interior. Apart from the new laws which had to be submitted to the sanction of Parliament, it was necessary that the 2 chambers should be ready for any emergency. A vast conspiracy, of which the threads had not yet been gathered together, was suspected. It was vaguely known that George and his gang had entered or were about to enter France, and that some of the conspirators had slipped into Paris, where they were lying in waiting. The investigations of the police to discover their hiding places had so far remained unsuccessful, and general anxiety prevailed. It would be difficult to imagine the anxieties resulting in sleepless nights which assailed the first consul, as I myself can testify, during the months of January 1804, when plots of which he knew nothing definite were being woven around him, and against which he fought in the dark, when he felt the earth trembling beneath his feet, and each breath of air seemed to bring with it the menace of some hidden danger. His courage was not abashed thereby. More fruitful in resource than his own police, who wasted their time in routine and impotent formalities. His clear-sightedness led him on to important discoveries and guided his hand to seize the hidden threads of the conspiracy. Profound was his indignation caused by the odious intrigues to which he was exposed, and by Pitt's answer to those who reproached him with wishing for perpetual war. We do not want it eternal, but only for a lifetime. A perpetual mental strain seemed from that time forward to disturb the calm and serenity of Napoleon's mind, without, however, changing the kindliness of his nature, if such an expression may be made use of without exaggeration. It was not that he feared for his personal safety. In this respect, he possessed an optimism which nothing could shake, and every open or secret precaution was repugnant to him, for he believed in his star and abandoned himself to his fate with entire confidence. But I had opportunities for noticing that the vexation which he felt used to manifest itself in outbursts of anger, not indeed when in his family, but before witnesses, where such outbursts were not wasted. It was always in public that his displeasure burst out, usually in the form of reprimands, which were often severe, but which were always limited to words. He thought that these scenes were necessary to keep vigilance awake and to stimulate a zeal which had to increase with the difficulties of the circumstances. The plots which were brewed in the interior of France were favored on our frontiers by the machinations concerted between the English ministers and the French princes who were in refuge in London. The instigators of these conspiracies were the English ambassadors to the smaller courts, Sir Francis Drake at Munich, and Spencer Smith, brother to the admiral of that name, at Stuttgart. Wickham, the English agent, had returned to Bern, where he was playing anew the part of corrupter, which in 1795, 1796, and 1797 he had played towards Pichegru. Taylor was playing the same part at Kassel, a man whose extreme opinions under the Reign of Terror had brought him into suspicion with the government. Méneval de la Touche was his name, made good his escape from Oloron, to which he had been banished to England, passing by Guernsey. He passed himself off as Lord Hawkesbury, the minister, and the exiles who formed the council of the Comte d'Artois as the envoy of the Republican malcontents in Paris, and professed to be anxious to atone for former errors by serving the Bourbons and working towards the overthrow of the first consul. He won the confidence both of Lord Hawkesbury and the exiles, and was sent on to Sir Francis Drake in Munich as charged with the execution of a great conspiracy against France. This agent gave him instructions, and supplying him with money, sent him on to Paris to the imaginary Jacobin Committee, the existence of which Méneval had asserted, there to contrive the best means of getting rid of Bonaparte. Méneval, on his arrival at Strasbourg, being anxious, as he declared, to secure permission to return to France, revealed his business to the prefect, who listened to his revelations and sent him on to Paris. Here, Méneval communicated to the government the instructions and powers he had received from Sir Francis Drake, and gave the information which he had obtained. He was authorized to continue his correspondence, which was favored by the means in the power of the police. He pretended to have won over the usher of the first consul's cabinet, and to be able, thanks to the offices of this man, to obtain documents from the emperor's private cabinet at St. Cloud, which he described himself as having communicated to the secretary of the Jacobin Committee to be copied. As a matter of fact, these documents were manufactured by Méneval himself, and it is needless to say that he had no understanding whatever with the usher of the consul's cabinet, and that the secretary of the committee, like the committee itself, had never existed. My name had to be mentioned to give an air of truth to Monsieur Méneval's reports. But as the first consul did not wish those in whom he confided to be the objects of suspicion, Sir Francis Drake's correspondent was ordered to add that the secretary of the committee was not to be confounded with me, who was the first consul's secretary, that this secretary was the intimate friend of General Duroc, and that on this account the first consul gave him the work that I had no time to do. This was the only part in which Napoleon would allow his cabinet to play in a hoax which covered the English agents with confusion. Méneval and Captain de Rosy, who was sent to his place, to Sir Francis Drake and to Spencer Smith as the aide-de-camp of a general who was none other than Méneval himself, and who described himself as in a position to raise several departments of France in a revolt, obtained from the English agents close upon £8,000, placed at their disposal by the liberality of the English ministry. The French government communicated to the members of the diplomatic corps in residence in Paris the various documents forming the correspondence between Meneval and de Rosy, and the agents in this work of corruption. Their comments were the condemnation of the shameful policy of the British cabinet. The agents whom he had compromised in this affair were dismissed from the courts to which they were accredited, and nothing more was heard from them afterwards. 2 months later, another English agent at Hamburg, Rumbold, continued the maneuvers of his colleagues, but taking a lesson from their disgrace, acted with greater circumspection. During one night in the month of October 1804, he was seized and removed, together with all his papers, by a detachment of French soldiers. Brought on to Paris, his papers were examined, but this examination led to no discovery. The intervention of the King of Prussia, as director of the Lower Saxony Circle, restored him to liberty. A confidential and friendly exchange of letters passed on this occasion between the First Consul and the King of Prussia, and it is to be regretted that the letters of the King of Prussia were lost, with the original letters of various sovereigns, which have disappeared from the imperial archives. A publication which appeared at this time showed the attempts which have been previously made by the princes of the House of Bourbon to establish communications with certain members of the French army and with residents in the interior of France and exile, Monsieur de Montgaillard, who had been in the confidence of the French princes and had been charged by them to negotiate with Pichegru and Moreau, came to offer the consular government some very curious revelations on this subject. He was commissioned to write a book showing all the circumstances of Pichegru's treachery and revealing all the plots which had been set on foot, either with or without the cooperation of the French princes, by the English government. Monsieur de Montgaillard sent in to the First Consul a series of manuscripts, one of which was a memorandum on Pichegru's treachery in the years 3, 4, and 5. With the text of the secret correspondence, the explanation of the ciphers used, and the key to the names. Another of his manuscripts was entitled Secret Memoirs of Monsieur J.G. de Montgaillard during the years of his exile. These 2 manuscripts, in which the author confessed that he had played a double part, contained some curious revelations on the intrigues of the exiled princes and of the English agents, and on the illusions of their nomad little court. The First Consul, whose duty it was, as the head of a government, to lend his ear to traitors and to turn the scandal of their revelations to profit, ordered that these manuscripts should be printed and published. The peculiar details which they contained, some well-drawn portraits, amongst others the portrait of the Pretender, helped to enlighten the public mind, and if they did little credit to the author's sense of honor, at least they testified to his intelligence. I was commissioned to correspond with Monsieur de Montgaillard, to pay over to him the sums which Napoleon allotted to him. During the time that I was in relations with this person, I received from him numerous manuscripts, of which some were printed, such as those which related to the foundation of a 4th dynasty, to the reestablishment of the kingdom of Italy under the Emperor Napoleon, to the rights of the French crown under the Duchy of Rome, and so on.